of the Spokane Society, and it is lovely to see you back, to welcome you back for the beginning of our spring series. We have 4 lectures this spring on the 3rd Thursdays of the month, and we're very glad you could join us for this first one, going through April. Hold on, let's see, got a thing there. Okay, good. We are in our 75th year, and I have some exciting information about that, which I will share with you shortly. We are working through a hybrid system, which means that if you can't make one of the 4 lectures this spring, we will have an opportunity for you to watch it online, live, and several of our speakers have allowed us to tape and to make available for short or longer periods of time their lectures. And we have an AIA YouTube site which allows us to post these. So if you miss a lecture and you'd like to have a chance to view it, those opportunities exist. COVID has been a good at least for one thing. In terms of technology, we've made some big advances. And so we're now offering these hybrid lectures. And we're glad that those of you at home could make it, as well as those of you here tonight in the audience. This is a live presentation, and those at home, this recording is strictly prohibited. We respect the intellectual property of our presenters, and we ask the viewers to do the same. For those of you unfamiliar with the AIA, and I see some new faces here, we are the largest and oldest organization for archaeologists in the United States. We have quite a few members, including some here today in the audience. The Spokane Society is one of dozens of societies across the United States. We do all kinds of work supporting archaeology, archaeologists, educators, excavators, through research, publication, site preservation, and much, much more. We're volunteers. This is a nonprofit, and we appreciate your support for what we do. We have a Facebook site, which we've been using for the last several years, but I'm particularly pleased to announce that we have gone live at long last with our own website. We are now here. It's SpokaneAIA.com. Easy to remember. In fact, our speaker tonight, who I'll introduce shortly, is the one who put it all into action. We'll now be having on this site quite a bit of our own material, and we'll also be linking it to other lectures and other archaeological information taking place across the area. So we're hoping to make it an archaeological resource for the community, for those who want to learn more about not just what is going on abroad, but also what's going on in our own region. So we're very excited about this, and we hope that you'll go take a spin around the site and begin to use it regularly for information about our lecture series. Again, we have our YouTube videos, which we began last year. And so if you missed a few and you want to catch up, there are a bunch up there. We invite you to view these. As always, whether it be online or here at the MAC, our lectures are free and open to the public. And this is for the Spokane community and our area. The AIA National Society this year began last fall with a really wonderful new lecture series, which is online. The recognition was that we have experts who are connected with our organization all across the world. And now, through the magic of Zoom, we can put you in touch with these folks on a regular basis for free. So rather than carting people around the world, they're able to put together what they're calling the Archaeology Hour lectures. It's just an hour. In fact, they cut it off at just an hour. And they've had a number of very impressive speakers. The most recent, which was on Tuesday, was Kara Cooney, who is an Egyptologist and quite well known from various television shows and things that she's done. The next one, and they're oftentimes on the 3rd Tuesday, so either right before, or this one, in fact, is going to be right after our next lecture. Dr. Joan Connolly of NYU, who is an underwater archaeologist, is going to talk about Western Cyprus, sites in Cyprus. So if you have nothing going on, it's 7 p.m. and it's the third Tuesday, I catch another archaeology lecture. These are available as well. You just go to the archaeology site, www.archaeological.org. That's the AIA national website, and links are there for registration. It's free, and we welcome you to join us for those. And then there's the gala. We have quietly been working, and I should actually say Cindy Bell, our board member, has been quietly working to put together what is going to be an extravaganza. We did one for the 65th up north, which was a lovely dinner, but this one's going to be, I think, even more interesting. Our gala will take place on Saturday, May 6th. It's going to round out our year of lectures. So after our 4 lectures, we have this specific gala celebrating our 75th year here in Spokane. It's a twofer. And for those of you who know me from the past, I used to work at a site called Gordian in Turkey, famous for King Midas. And in 2001, the University of Pennsylvania, which runs the Gordian expeditions, announced that when the tomb was excavated in 1957, they found large amounts of food, which they promptly sampled, sent back to the United States, put in a storeroom, and forgot. The amazing thing was that because they had done this with a good deal of foresight, the samples were still there. And when gas chromatology and various other forms of analysis became available and affordable, they began to figure out what the food was. And in 2001, they recreated the meal at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're going to do a not exact, but close spin-off on that as our gala dinner. So you will be, well, it's a late 8th century tumulus. So we'll be dining in the Iron Age with what is, I think, a really lovely menu, to be followed up by a lecture by Dr. Richard Liebhardt, the international expert on the tomb, its excavation and its preservation. So dinner and a lecture. This will be out in the valley. We have sheets which are outside if you want to find out more information. It is limited registration. That is, we only have so much space there, and it's going to be, there's going to be about 70 spots open, 75 spots open for people to sign up. We're going to begin the sign up probably this week, and for those of you who are interested and can make that date, we welcome you to join us. It'll be $65 for the dinner and lecture evening, which I think is going to be a wonderful experience for anyone who can join us. So hope you will. We're really looking forward to it. And again, more information can be found on our new SpokaneAIA.com website, as well as outside on the table. Okay. Oh, and this is the food. It's going to be good. We're going to be doing this a lamb dish and with lentils. A lot of it is actually based on the food, and they have actually reconstructed the beverage that they were drinking. A group in Delaware made it. It's called Midas Touch. I don't know if anybody here has tried it, but we're going to have a pony keg of Midas Touch there for people to sample. It should be a lovely evening. Our second lecture coming up in February 16th, actually, will feature Dr. Randall Souza. Randy is a professor at Seattle University and a colleague of mine. He works in Sicily. So we will move from Northumberland, which will be our location tonight, to Sicily. Then we're going to be moving to the Pacific Ocean, the tours of Magellan in March. And in April, we'll be revolving back to ancient Egypt, where we began our lecture series early this year. So lots of places, lots of wonderful archaeology to come. Tonight's lecture features one of our own. And I always like to say that because we do have archaeologists who teach in our community, and we try to get one every year, or at least every other year. And the sucker of this, the volunteer of this year is my colleague, Brian Buchanan, who is a board member of our local AA and generously agreed to speak with us about his new work. For those of you who have not met Brian, Brian is an assistant professor at Eastern Washington University in geography and anthropology. He got his MA from American University and his PhD from Durham in the UK, and that's how he got associated with these projects. He has worked all over the world, including the Pacific Northwest, Tunisia, the UK, and the Ukraine. So he has quite wide experience. He's a landscape archaeologist, and so his interest is in the complexities of how past societies consciously and unconsciously interacted and altered the land around them, environmental archaeology. And he's a specialist in GIS, and other digital technology. We are very, very pleased to welcome him tonight to talk about his most recent field work, fresh out of the field. And so this is very exciting to hear what he's been up to in his talk this evening. More Than Just a Mead Hall, A World's Wonder, 8th of 7, Reassessing the Archaeology and Landscape of Yeavering, Northumberland. Please welcome Dr. Brian Buchanan.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Andy. And also thank you all for coming out on I was going to say cold January evening when I was preparing this lecture a few weeks ago, but not quite that, a little bit rainy. Since I last chatted with you all in 2019, there's been a lot of exciting developments in the research of the early medieval kingdom of Northumbria, which I have been privileged to be a part of. Tonight, I will be discussing the recent work by myself and collaborators at the early medieval royal palace site of Yeavering, which is a key historical and archaeological site, and is an example of a large Great Hall complex located in what is today Northumberland, England, along the Anglo-Scottish border. Now, Yeavering is arguably not only the most important site excavated within the early medieval kingdom of Northumbria, it's considered a type site for these Great Hall complexes of similar scale and form that are scattered across the North Sea zone. Dr. Brian Hope Taylor's seminal excavations of the site at Yeavering in the early 1950s and 60s were an important study for not only early medieval British archaeology, but also for the development of archaeological field methods. The meticulous excavations revealed the complex site of the Villa Regia Ad Gefrin, or as we call it today, Yeavering, that was noted by the Venerable Bede as a royal meeting place of Northumbrian kings. Now, Yeavering has become a type site for understanding these types of complexes that are stretched across not only Britain, but across all of Northwestern Europe due to its unique architectural forms. And I'll talk a lot about those tonight, such as its wooden, double palisaded wooden great enclosure, these very large wooden halls that you can see a reconstruction there in the center, as well as unique structures that are found nowhere else in Europe. And all of these together are taken as indicative of the rise of kingdoms and the power structures of the kings in this early medieval period, as we're transitioning away from provincial Roman Britannia up to medieval, what becomes medieval England and medieval Scotland. Now, landscape archaeologists have focused on understanding the Anglo-Saxon reuse of prehistoric monuments, and Yeavering is a key example of this, as it's close to, if not overlying, a number of prehistoric monuments, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on today. Similar sites have been excavated since Yeavering was first identified, and Yeavering was the first one of these site types identified in Britain, such as at Charlton in Hampshire or Sutton Courtenay. But it still remains to be the type site, not only for British early medieval Great Hall complexes, but Great Hall complexes across the whole North Sea zone, partly because it's the most widely excavated. And it has entered into the lore of early medieval studies across Europe for its importance due to what Hope Taylor found at this site, which I'll talk about. Now, Yeavering was one of the first sites discovered from the air in Britain using remote sensing. And Hope Taylor's excavations helped develop on-site illustration and recording as a central element of field archaeology. But while no one could deny the impact of Hope Taylor's excavations, New discoveries and interpretations over the last 50 years have called into question some of his ideas, particularly concerning the phasing and the functioning of the site. So this paper is going to discuss not only what Hope Taylor did, but more importantly, what myself and other collaborators have done to identify new findings at the site and suggest future avenues of research for understanding Yeavering's place in understanding these great hall complexes across Europe. But the first thing I want to do is talk about the title a bit, that very wordy title that I made Andy read earlier. And apologies, when you start to think about these things in August, you think, man, that's a good title. And then when you start to look at it in December, you're like, wow, what was I thinking? And I had to remind myself of what it was. And that was because I took it from this book. This is a new translation of Beowulf by Maria Headley, and it is fantastic. It's a wonderful translation of one of the oldest surviving works in literature worldwide. Headley's translation infuses this classic tale with modern language and a focus not only on the warrior Beowulf, but a much more sympathetic examination of Grendel and Grendel's mother. But for tonight, I wanted to flag up the quote in the first few pages of Headley's translation: more than just a Mead Hall, a world's wonder, 8th of 7. This quote is about Heorot, the large wooden mead hall and residence of King Hrothgar, and setting of much of Beowulf. This large wooden hall is seen as a wonder due to its scale, its richness, and its renown. Now, although Beowulf is focused on a Danish king's residence, it's actually an Anglo-Saxon poem. It's an Old English poem. So we know that the people that were living in Britain would have been familiar with these ideas of these large, great halls, okay, and would have associated them with nobility or kingship in the period. And archaeologically speaking, they had found these all across Scandinavia, Germany, and the Low Countries, but they were not found in Britain until Yeavering was discovered in the mid-20th century. That did not stop historians talking about the importance of these halls and for understanding the growth of kingdoms in this period. And one of the most familiar, probably to the general public, is The Lord of the Rings. These large kingly residences inspired generations of medievalists, and Tolkien was no exception. Now, for people that have seen the movies or read the books, what they may not know is that J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor at Oxford, and he was a medievalist and specialist on the Anglo-Saxon literature, and particularly Beowulf, okay? And it is no surprise, that if you see in the movies, when they go to Edoras, the great hall of the king of the Rohan is modeled almost exactly on Heorot from Beowulf, okay? So these great halls have had a lot of meaning for historians throughout the centuries, even though they hadn't really found any evidence of them in Britain. When Tolkien was writing, he was writing this in the 30s and 50s, prior to Yeavering being identified. In fact, what archaeologists were talking about early medieval settlements in Britain before this was a little less glowing. This was from E.T. Leeds, who was an expert in Anglo-Saxon art, and he excavated one of the first early medieval settlements from the period, a 6th century site called Sutton Courtenay. And this quote, I'll read it for you: "The bulk of people, we can now be assured, were content with something that hardly deserves a better title than that of a hovel. In such cabins with bare headroom amid a filthy litter of broken bones of food and scattered pottery lived the Anglo-Saxons." Very Monty Python-esque idea, I think, about the Dark Ages, right? And one of those things that, as a specialist in this period, really inspires hope looking at that quote. But I think it demonstrates his lack of enthusiasm for a very particular form, an architectural form that I'm going to spend some time talking about. And these are called sunken feature buildings, or Grubenhäuser, and they are emblematic of early medieval British society. They're relatively small, about 10 feet by 5 feet in cases, sometimes a little bit larger. And we're very inventive archaeologists with words. They are sunken buildings into the ground, so we call them sunken feature buildings. That's all he found there. He did not find the giant great halls that I'm going to talk about at Yeavering. And this quote really kind of reinforced, I think, archaeology's for archaeologists on ideas of the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, the early medieval period in Britain. Very little material culture, dark, damp, muddy houses. But all of this changed quite rapidly due to remote sensing, aerial reconnaissance, and the archaeology of a small valley in what is today Northumberland. The identification of the remains of Yeavering fundamentally shifted early medieval archaeology, and it remains one of the key sites for understanding this period. So, for the rest of the talk today, this is a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to introduce the history, the archaeology, and the landscapes of early medieval Britain. Let's get everybody on the kind of same page of what this period looked like. I'll give a bit of a background on the early medieval royal palace site, and then I'll spend the bulk of time talking about the work that we have conducted there over the last few years, with lots of pretty pictures later on. So as David Petz and Sam Turner note, the period of time from the 4th until the 12th centuries was one of profound social, economic, religious, and social change, political change in what is today southern Scotland and northern England. The inhabitants of Britain in this period witnessed dramatic changes due to the withdrawal of Roman power and the arrival of immigrants from continental Europe, as well as from other regions of Britain itself. Plus, to top it off, there was a lot of climatic changes occurring this time that affected the crops and affected population, severe population decline. Proverbial dark ages, right? So at the beginning of this period in the early 4th century, central Britain was a frontier militarized zone along the northern boundary of both Roman Britannia and the Roman Empire as a whole. This was the northern limits of empire. By the early 5th century, Roman political control of Britain had effectively collapsed, and central Britain became an area of contested political and ethnic identities due to broad movements of people during the migration period and associated culture contact. Now, Northumbria materialized out of this tumultuous period by the 7th century through the unification of two earlier kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira, as you can see on the map on the right. The development of this kingdom is still shrouded in mystery. We're not quite sure how it coalesced in the beginning due to limited historical documentation of the period as well as limited archaeological evidence. But needless to say, by the 7th century, this was an absolutely massive kingdom. It was well known throughout not only Britain, but across Europe at the time. And that was a problem for Northumbria because those guys with those horned helmets, not really, but how we talk about them in pop culture, the Vikings targeted Northumbria first when they invaded Britain, because this was a center of learning, it was a center of wealth. So they targeted Lindisfarne, Holy Island. It was the first place they landed, and Northumbria basically gets ground down through the years due to the Vikings establishing the Danelaw, and eventually due to the warfare between the other English kingdoms and the Danelaw consolidating to England, Northumbria ceases to be. So this very powerful kingdom in the early medieval period basically comes down to us through its archaeological evidence and the place name evidence. Northumbria transforms into Northumberland. And it's, again, very important and easy name to remember, north of the Humber being a river estuary. That's what Northumberland and Northumbria mean. So much of the scholarship on the Kingdom of Northumbria has focused on the so-called Golden Age, this period of time after the spread of Christianity in the early 7th century through the Viking raids in the late 8th and 9th. This period is when key religious developments and conversions occurred alongside the rapid consolidation of power by the kings. So we're transforming from kind of roaming warbands into basically small nation states with a king and associated nobility, not the king and nobility that you think of with like later medieval and very established. This is a much different form of kingship, but it's starting to become a very powerful localized place. Historically and archaeologically, Northumbria is represented by iconic sites such as Lindisfarne and Bamburgh Castle, as well as the establishment of York, which becomes one of the major cities of the medieval period, medieval England. Individuals such as King Edwin, King Oswald, St. Cuthbert, and St. Hild as well as artifacts such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, the pectoral cross of Cuthbert, and carved stone sculpture that you can see there, the Ruthwell Cross, are monuments to this period. But perhaps most importantly is that very artistic 19th century artistic view of the Venerable Bede, Saint Bede, who is quite famous for historians as well as archaeologists. Bede, well, we claim, writes the earliest history of the English people in the ecclesiastic history of the English church and its people. Bede's scholarship is one of the primary reasons the 7th and 8th centuries are such a focus of early medieval scholarship, because this period, we don't have a lot of historical documentation. Bede's work is key for a lot of archaeology of this period because it's one of the few things that actually talks not only about the people, but the places. Now, the Venerable Bede lived in Northumbria at the twinned monasteries of Jarrow and Monk Wearmouth. And he was writing in the early 8th century, is considered not only the first historical account, but one of the most accurate accounts of the period, of the English period, the English people. Now, before further discussing Yeavering and its landscape, I think it's helpful to take one step back to what was happening in Roman Britain, okay? Julius Caesar invaded Britain in approximately 55 BC, and he didn't get very far, okay? And he went back to Gaul, became an emperor, but he never really did much in Britain. It wasn't until Emperor Claudius invaded Britain in 43 AD that basically Rome just marched across and conquered much of what is today England, southern Scotland, and huge portions of Wales. Now, the Romans held power over Roman Britannia until the early 5th century, where unrest across the empire forced the emperor at the time to basically tell the people in Roman Britain, you guys are on your own, okay? That roughly 400 years, though, double the time of what our country's been a country, by the way. It's always helpful to kind of think about these large spans, dramatically changed the British landscape. Language, dress, culture, but more importantly, for a landscape archaeologist like myself, lots of alterations to the landscape and the built environment. Roads, baths, towns, villas were all built out of stone. The Romans loved to build out of stone, and those are still upstanding in many locations on the British landscape today. I actually think that's partly why we have this kind of common idea of the Dark Ages, because the early medievalists did not build out of stone. They were very skilled carpenters and built out of wood. But if anybody's ever been to Britain or knows anything about British weather, wood doesn't last too long there, unfortunately. So it's a lot harder for archaeologists to find these sites, whereas the Roman stuff, it's still upstanding in many places today. So I want to kind of flag that up because that's going to be one of the things we talk about when we're talking about Yeavering and how it was found and how we do archaeology there. So the period of time following the fall of Rome was traditionally thought of as this time of horror and cultural destruction. That's what we Western civilization students for the last 200 years have thought about the end of Rome, right? The period where the classical ideals and ideas of Rome were forgotten or abandoned due to the barbarian hordes destroying Rome, and we enter this Dark Ages, okay? Architecture, art, and philosophical thought were all thought lost. But I want to argue that this was not a Dark Age. It was a transformative age, and it was a much different age. But the people that were living in early medieval Britain had very sophisticated forms of architecture, very sophisticated dress and metalworking and style. It's the fact that most of that is very difficult for us to see historically and archaeologically that I think has contributed to some of these ideas. But what is not up for debate is that there were major changes. These are dramatically different types of buildings that early medieval people were living in, and we'll talk a little bit about more of those as we go on. So that's a bit of the background to what's happening. Now I want to talk about the site itself, okay? I want to focus the rest of the talk on Yeavering and the work we've been doing at the site over the last, I've been working at this since 2010, but my colleague, Professor Sarah Semple, who's the principal investigator on this, has been working off and on this since 2005. Archaeology projects take a while. The permits alone take years to get through sometimes. So Sarah Semple, Professor Sarah Semple at Durham University. Roger Mikett, he is a part of the Gefrin Trust that owns and manages the site. Dr. Tudor Skinner and myself are the primary investigators on this project. Tudor and I both started our PhD at the same time and working underneath Sarah, and we've been fortunate enough to kind of stay working on these long after we've graduated. So this project, we have to talk about how it was initially excavated, okay? So Bede, the Venerable Bede, to go back to him, he describes the royal residence of Ad Gefrin, or Yeavering, in his History of the English Church. And he states that the missionary Paulinus accompanied the king and queen of Northumbria to Ad Gefrin in AD 627. And then he spent 36 days there baptizing and instructing the local populace, okay? He talks about Paulinus baptizing those folks in the River Glen. Okay, and place name stuff is important here for how we identified this site. Now, as early as the 17th century, the surveyor Camden noted the association between Bede's Ad Gefrin and the township of Yeavering. There's a township today called Yeavering there, and he was linking them, but the exact location of this royal palace site was unknown until the 1940s and 50s. An archaeologist by the name of St. Joseph was doing aerial reconnaissance over Northumberland, looking primarily for prehistoric hill forts, and he came across a series of crop marks, anomalies in the vegetation where the archaeology underneath the ground had affected the overlying vegetation in a small field west of the town of Wooler. And that is, let me see if I get the right button here. Yes. This is St. Joseph's slide, okay? And hopefully you can see kind of staining in the black and white image here. This is a series of rectangular halls. You can see another one there, some down here. This is a series of great halls. This is actually massive, over 70 meters long. These are huge wooden structures. And then right here, you have this double palisaded enclosure, okay? Double wooden palisaded enclosure that Hope Taylor, the archaeologist that eventually goes and excavates, dubs the Great Enclosure. To go back to the fact that archaeologists are really inventive with our names, right? Because it was very large. So Hope Taylor begins to excavate this site in the 1950s and finishes in the 1960s. He primarily focuses his trenches across these features that St. Joseph found in these aerial photos. These features are found on a kind of small elevated gravel platform known as a whaleback. And that is what this image is here. It's called a whaleback because it looks like when a whale is kind of cresting out of the water, it's a large elevated platform above the surrounding area. So the early medieval royal palace site is right there. You'll have to believe me because again, wooden structures, all decayed, no upstanding monuments. There will be pictures showing them later, don't worry. Right here, it is at the foothills of the Cheviot Hills. And on top of this, hopefully you can see, I'm not sure if you can see that kind of faint ring around the top there. That is an Iron Age hill fort. Those are collapsed stone walls from a prehistoric site, the largest hill fort in the region. Those are still visible today. You can stand there, you can look up and you can see the collapsed walls. That's from about 500 BC. So almost 1,000 years later, or slightly over 1,000 years later, when the early medieval palace site's getting built, they're putting it right next to this prehistoric monument. Now, landscape archaeologists argue that is on purpose. These Anglo-Saxon kings that are coming into Britain and claiming power over the land are linking their places of power, their early medieval royal palaces, to these prehistoric monuments. They're tying themselves ancestrally to the landscape, saying, that was a kingly residence, here's my kingly residence, I have dominion over the area. And that's something that repeats all across Britain. All the early medievalists love to put their houses, they love to bury their dead, all in these prehistoric monuments. You find a prehistoric tomb, there's probably an Anglo-Saxon prince at the top of it. They just broke in. And that's important a little bit later on for the story as we go. Okay. So Hope Taylor found some really interesting forms here. And he was able to link it to Bede's Yeavering, based upon the place name evidence, based upon the location, and based upon the size and scale of it. He also found this quite interesting feature right here. It's a wooden amphitheater. Only one found throughout Europe. Basically, they are building what looks like a Roman amphitheater out of wood. It's a grandstand. Why? Well, probably because of the way kingship worked in this period. The king was not, stable at one location. It wasn't like later medieval period where the king might be in the Tower of London and that was his home base. Early medieval kingship, you had to roam. You had to roam across the landscape. You had to make an appearance. You had to give them lots of mead at these mead halls, and you had to feast your retainers. So the king was constantly moving across the landscape with their retinue. And these are known as assembly sites, because when the king would come, everybody was expected to come and assemble. They would hear any laws the king had. There would be any judgments that the king had to make, and there would be trading, okay? Generally trading, in this case, of cattle, one of the primary forms of wealth in the early medieval period. So the idea is that this was probably for the king to chat with the local inhabitants of the area. Some scholars have argued, though, that this may have been more for Paulinus. When he's baptizing the local populace, converting them to Christianity, Christianity in the early medieval period was not in nice stone churches, it was outside. That is early Christianity in this period. So what better than, rather than having you sit on the ground, it does rain a lot in Britain, remember, have a nice grandstand to sit on and watch the service, as it were, listen to Paulinus. So this is the plan of Hope Taylor's excavations. And one of the important things noted by Hope Taylor, as well as other scholars that have examined the site, is the careful alignment and arrangement of these structures. Hope Taylor argued that specific areas of the sites had very specific functions. With the structures along the western part of the site, here, he dubbed the temple complex, mainly because there was a lot of people buried there, early medieval people buried there, and a lot of butchered animal bones. So he was kind of saying there was cultic activities here associated with life and death. What's really intriguing, though, is here's that grandstand. I had a student a few years ago tell me it looked like a Wi-Fi signal, and I have to admit they're kind of right. But here is the Great Hall. Multiple Great Halls, and this is the intriguing part. These buildings show evidence of burning, but instead of, like, if you've ever come across a burnt building or anything burned, it always leaves a lot of debris. They would go and clean it out and build a hall in the exact location again. And they did that 4 times. Why not just build it slightly to the left or right? Because we think that this has a very significant orientation to everything else on the site, that it had to be placed there. So one of my early archaeology professors told me the history of archaeology is a human builds something, it burns down, they build again. Because up until modern firefighters, which are amazing, we had fires in our houses with not good flue systems, and the places burned down quite a bit, okay? The fact that they kept building in that same location is very intriguing and very important. The other thing we have these 4 buildings all on a very similar alignment to each other, but not aligned with anything else. And then we have this great enclosure. The great enclosure is weird, okay? Because usually when you're looking at the medieval period or the Roman or the prehistoric, when people build giant palisades, they put their settlements inside of them and not outside of them. So this is a kingly residence. What this is interpreted is they're not worried about getting battles here. They're not worried about there's no defensive fortifications around the site whatsoever. So this enclosure does not appear to be for defense. So what is it? Corral. Very good. That's one of the main things that we think it is for. And one of the reasons we think that is because when the king would assemble, people would probably have to bring their cattle down and trade with the king. So where do you put it? You put it in a giant stockyard where things are happening. But there is a building inside. And actually, some of the new work that we're doing think we might have some other buildings inside. So we're not quite sure, and that's one of the new things we're going to talk about here, is that we're doing testing on the soils themselves to determine if this was a stock area. Now, John Blair has argued the orientation of the structures was not accidental. There is a theme here, and there is an important theme here related to kingship and organizational power. You basically, if you're going to build a site like this out of wood, this requires a lot of effort and a lot of teamwork, okay? Because you have to go off to the forest, because Britain, not full of forests, if you can think of the landscape of England, even in the early medieval period, not a lot of wooded areas. So they would have to traverse great distances with this wood. Then they would have to build these on very specific alignments. And to top that off, there's this. This was a grave that Hope Taylor excavated, a single grave, singular being on its own. There was like 2 cemeteries on the site, but this one was found right outside the door of the Great Hall. And what's interesting about this individual is this. I don't know if you can see that. There's this kind of cross-shaped item there. It is interpreted by Hope Taylor and others as a groma, which is a Roman surveying tool. So Blair argues that this site was particularly surveyed using a very age-old technique that the Romans had, basically to lay things out in very orderly rows and orientations. And that was so important that this individual, when they died, they were buried in a singular way with that tool. So there's a lot going on this site. After the excavation of Yeavering, which, reminder, it was the first one of these found in Britain, there have been other ones that have come to light across England and Scotland. I don't believe there's any in Wales. I always feel bad. I don't know as much about Wales. But there's been none in Scotland or England until Yeavering, and there's been many since, including this reconstruction drawing of Cowdrey's Down. And the one on the right, this is Lyminge in Kent. This is only from 5 years ago, relatively newfound site. All of these great hall complexes are linked with the kings or other nobility. They are linked to this growth of kingdoms in the early medieval period. And these kingdoms eventually transform into the kingdoms of Scotland and England and Wales that we know today as nation states. But Yeavering remains a type site for understanding these complexes, as it is still one of the most completely excavated of those types of sites, and arguably one of the best published. But that said, there are still key issues that are driving us to go back there. Firstly, it was only partially explored. Hope Taylor only excavated north of the road, because that was the only crop marks that St. Joseph found. But since then, this is an image from 2001. There is a lot of stuff going on south of the road. There's another hall there, other structures, and actually right here, sorry, that kind of round black disc, that's a Neolithic henge. That's about 7,000 years before present. So this landscape is chock-a-block of all kinds of archaeology. So Hope Taylor never explored south of the road, and we want to, because that is a part of the picture of this site. Secondly, the landscape around the site is now a lot more complex, or at least we recognize it as being more complex. Other early medieval sites have been found within a few miles of Yeavering, such as at Thurlings, Millfield, and Spruceton. And they all seem to be elite sites, maybe not to the scale of Yeavering, but in a similar manner. And that leads to one of the major issues. Okay, Hope Taylor, when he was excavating in the 50s and 60s, all the phasing he did on the site was based on history. He did not use any radiocarbon dating. That's not because he didn't want to, it's because it was just invented when he started excavating the site. So we have no absolute dating of any of the ages of the site. So we can't tell you if Yeavering was existing at the same time as these other settlements, if it preceded them, or if it followed. So these are some of the reasons we want to go back, or we have gone back. And these kicked off a reinvestigation of the site between 2005 and 2016, led by Dr. Sarah Semple of Durham University. So Professor Semple worked with other scholars to perform geophysics at the site, as well as to fly drones over the landscape. And we were finding a lot of new features. I'm not sure if it shows up, but can you see this kind of round feature right there? This is where the early medieval palace site is, the whaleback. That was found less than 5 years ago by one of my students. Never been seen before. We think that's a Bronze Age ring ditch. 2 other ones were found on that site, were excavated by Hope Taylor, and both of them were full of early medieval graves, because early medieval people like to put their burials inside of prehistoric monuments. What's weird is the actual orientation of the site respects that round feature, and the temple complex goes like a zigzag around it, which is always puzzled archaeologists. Why is it shaped like this? Probably because they were avoiding that feature. So what is geophysics? Just as a bit of a reminder, because I just said the word geophysics. Some of you probably know what it is, but in case you don't, it's a cost-effective, non-intrusive, and quick method of detecting subsurface features. The primary methods are magnetometry, electrical resistivity, and ground-penetrating radar. Basically, archaeological features, when humans in the past dug into the ground and they built a wall, or they placed a wooden fence, or they put their house, it changes the geochemistry. It changes the magnetic properties of that soil, so that compared to the natural soils in the area, you can spot archaeological features like that there. So we wanted to go do a lot of geophysics at the site, and that led to where we could put new trenches to excavate, to find new features. The other thing we did as a part of this preliminary work was to actually go and look at the Hope Taylor Archive in historic Scotland, where basically a number of artifacts that were never cataloged or published from the site, as well as a photographic archive that we thought had been lost, were actually found. One of the key reasons this was so important was we had a postdoctoral research assistant, Dr. Sarah Dooley Fairchild. She went through like 4 months of work to catalog all these images, so we could actually look at, here is the grandstand being excavated in the middle of quite a harsh winter for Northumberland. I don't envy them. Pre-Gore-Tex, that would not have been fun. But this right here was intriguing, because that right there, do you see all these black blobs at the bottom here? That's burnt timber. Burnt timber is very useful for radiocarbon dating. And we were looking through the photographic archives, and we had hopes that some of it may have been preserved at the bottom of this building. So that led us to start excavating in March of 2020. That's where I was about to leave with 3 students from Eastern, and all of a sudden we heard about this COVID thing. And basically our flights were canceled, and we got pushed back to the summer of 2021, where we were finally able to get out here. So the pilot phase, we opened up a series of trenches. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this talk chatting about. The key questions we really wanted to get at were, we wanted to try and find stuff to do radiocarbon with. We were hoping to find charcoal, bits of burnt wood, bits of burnt animal bone that we could do radiocarbon dating. So then we could actually date this site. We wanted to assess the extent and condition of the archaeological material. We wanted to try and find new features, if we could, that would help better explain the site itself. We also wanted to establish the environmental and faunal characteristics of the gravel terrace. We did that through a geochemical analysis that's still ongoing. I watched 2 gentlemen walk basically every 20 feet and take a soil core, and they're analyzing that. And they're looking for phosphates. And they're looking for phosphates, to go back to your point earlier, where there is a lot of cattle in a stockade. That affects the geochemical signature. There's going to be a lot of phosphate in the soil. So if we have concentrations of it, we can perhaps say that great enclosure was used for stockading animals. So the first thing we did was we did a new geophysics survey. So right here in the center, that was the geophysics done by Professor Semple in 2006. We expanded that. We did all this in red using a cart on the back of an ATV. They can do it really quick. And then last summer, I led students from Eastern Washington University and Durham University to do the areas in blue. And we did that handheld, which is a little bit slower, but finer resolution. And this is what we got. This geophysics is giving us quite a complete picture of things. It's also quite a bit confusing if you're not used to looking at geophysics signatures, but I'll point out some features. This is the whale back here, where the early medieval palace site is. Right across the way, hopefully you can see that giant donut-looking thing. That appears to be an Iron Age hill fort. Not really high up like Yeavering Bell, but again, Anglo-Saxon early medieval people love to put their dead into prehistoric monuments. So we have high hopes for that, having more early medieval stuff going on. We also found a similar one here, which is a little bit tougher to see. And we found, hopefully you can see those lines there. Those are also ditches for another, looks like Iron Age settlement. We care about the Iron Age prehistoric stuff from an early medieval perspective because the early medieval people want to put their stuff in prehistoric monuments. So those locations probably are going to have new features for us. When I was working through my slides earlier, some of my colleagues on the board were here and they pointed out all of this. And at first glance, it looks like a really sophisticated field system or maybe a prehistoric city. It's not. It's actually paleoglacial cracking. This was all under a glacier during the Ice Age. As the glacier retreated, basically this ground surface cracked, almost like dirt cracks in the summer when water is pulled away from it and it kind of cracks and fissures. This is happening underneath the topsoil. So from a geophysics perspective, you start to see this come up. You're like, oh my gosh, we found it. We found a huge village. And then you're like, no, it's just natural. But there's still a lot going on here that we're going to spend probably years exploring. So let's get to the excavation. We opened 2 trenches, both at the northern edge of the whaleback. This is the shot of the backhoe removing the soil. The first time anybody's excavated on this landform since Hope Taylor finished in 1962. Coincidentally, that gentleman there, that is Roger Mikett. He is the chair of the Gefrin Trust that owns this land. And when he was a grad student, he worked with Hope Taylor. So he was quite emotional actually watching this because he's been wanting to excavate here since 1982. It only took till 2021 to finally get those permits in order to get this going. So why did we put these trenches here? Well, this is Hope Taylor's plan of the C district, C1, 2, 3, and 4. And there was this green, it's highlighted in green, it wasn't green. It was a ditch feature that appeared that went past building C1 to a blob we saw in the geophysics. So we opened trench B over that blob, and we opened trench A because we were hoping that we would see a bit of the burnt timbers that were in that photographic archive at the bottom of that building. So this is a drone shot of our trench A and trench B. And what I want you to kind of pay attention to here is we are on the edge of the whaleback, and we are in this valley, this small valley, Glendale. Yeavering Bell is up to the left, and it almost forms a natural amphitheater where this early medieval royal palace site is. It's quite an enigmatic place. It's also a wind tunnel. It whips through here every day of the year, dries the soil out almost as soon as you excavate it. And in the winter, it's actually in shade for almost the whole day from the Yeavering Bell. I could not imagine a worse place to live in the early medieval period without central heating. So they are putting it here for a very specific reason. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful, but it's also absolutely brutal at times. So these are 2 overhead drone shots of trench A and trench B. And the discoloring that you're seeing in these images right there is reflective of the archaeological evidence. Over here in trench B, this is what we were hoping would be a building. It was a splodge we saw on the crop mark evidence and on the geophysics. Over here, this is the edge of building C1. This dark line here, that's the edge of Hope Taylor's trench from the 1950s and 60s. Then everything over here was not excavated at Hope Taylor. This was what we were hoping was that ditch that we spotted. So I'm going to talk through both trenches in a bit of detail now. This is trench A. Building C, and then as we were excavating, we found the ditch. We put some kind of keyholes through it. We found this really interesting oval pit, very dark stained with charcoal. And we found the remains of a ritual pit. And we call it ritual pit because that's what Hope Taylor called it. And this is Hope Taylor's picture. This is C1, the building. We are only capturing this portion of it in our trench. And there, in his picture, is that ritual pit. It's always fun to actually relocate what you're looking for exactly, especially because I was the guy that told them this is where it is. I had spent 5 years doing the GIS and doing it. So I bit through almost all my fingernails watching the backhoe go through here because that would have been a tremendous waste of money if we had got it wrong. And Sarah would not have been happy with me. But we refound it, and it was a good day at the pub that evening. So this ritual, actually, I'm going to go through this one. I want to go to here. The ritual pit we re-excavated, there was nothing there. Hope Taylor took everything out. This, Roger Mikett was so excited about. He's excavated dozens of these across this area. He's like, this is Neolithic. They're always full of bone. They're always full of artifacts. And there was nothing. He was so deflated. But there was, you can tell how black this is. There is charcoal. So we will radiocarbon date it. He is sure it dates to the Neolithic. So this is not related to the early medieval use of the landscape, but something that was used like thousands of years before on the same exact location. The ditch, as you can see again on this image, went through building C2 right past C1. It looks like it emptied out in that kind of splodge for Trench B. I was in charge of the ditch, so I spent a lot of time looking at Hope Taylor's excavations of the trench, of the ditch in building C2. This is his photograph of it. Here's his profile drawing. And why do archaeologists care about ditches? Well, when people build ditches, we tend to throw our garbage in them, okay? You see an open trench, go throw your cigarette butt in it. I mean, they weren't doing that in the early medieval period, but you have the general idea. Lots of bone, lots of things like that. So we're like, we're gonna get a lot of material culture here. And we found nothing. And at first that was a bit depressing, but then it became, what is this? Okay. So at first you're thinking, okay, maybe it's a drainage ditch. It rains a lot in Britain, right? Except for the fact that this is a sand and gravel terrace. I worked in the rain every day there. And when the rain would stop, 5 minutes later, it dried out completely. So you don't need a drainage ditch because this landform doesn't need it. So what is it there for? Well, sometimes you build ditches in like circles to keep your stock animals out of an area. This was a nice straight line. So we have a working hypothesis that it was leading to building to the Trench B splodge that we were hoping was a building. But we're still investigating it. It's very weird that there was nothing in this ditch from an archaeological perspective. So I spent weeks with my head kind of down like that for no artifacts, unfortunately. But it was fun. It was fun. Meanwhile, I kept hearing Roger on the other side trench exclaiming with glee, excavating building C1. So this is the map of it right here. And what we know, what Hope Taylor claimed this was, is that this is a sunken feature building or a Grubenhäuser. That thing that Leeds said was like this dark, dingy place that all the Anglo-Saxons lived in. Well, we found dozens of these now across Britain. They appear to be storage houses for storing food, storing bone. That's probably why we had bits of bone and broken pottery in them, but also seem to be locations where weaving was either undertaken or stored, because we find a lot of evidence of looms in these structures. So as a reminder, here's Hope Taylor's picture of it. And right here is all this burnt timber, and this is what we were hoping. That right there is what archaeologists call a balk, AKA a piece of dirt that we didn't excavate. And we use that to help us understand our stratigraphy as we go down. So we were hoping some of this wood extended into this balk, and then we'd be able to get some radiocarbon dating from it. But we were lucky. Hope Taylor was either preserving it for future archaeologists or a bit lazy, and he didn't just leave the balk, he left all the wood and timber there. All that black staining is wood from that structure 1,500 years old. It's so well preserved, we can still count the rings on the burnt trees. So not only are we going to be able to do radiocarbon dating on it, we might be able to do dendrochronology on it, tree ring dating, which will give us an exact date of how old that tree was when it was cut down, which is fantastic. It was exactly what we were hoping for and more out of this trench, which is why Roger was exclaiming with glee when I was down that ditch, because he had found it. Let's move on to Trench B. Trench B was put to the north of that trench because we found a little splodge on one of the aerial photos. Here's that ditch. Here's building C1. And then we saw this other splodge. And we're like, maybe that's something. And it was. It was the first new building that has been identified and excavated at this site since Hope Taylor's excavations in the 60s. And it is an odd one. This was extremely tricky stratigraphy here. Mostly sand that dried out instantaneously. So I brought my drone with me and I was setting it up every half hour because when you were standing at it, the soils that were the building would almost disappear in front of your eyes and you'd have to have an overhead shot in order to kind of understand what was going on. So we actually used a very old technique that Mortimer Wheeler put forward of leaving the balks inside the excavation unit because we needed those to help us understand the complex stratigraphy as we went down. And it turned out to be a really unique building. All these dots are post holes where there were wooden posts. At first glance, that doesn't make a lot of sense, okay? But what it was that this building was constantly getting rebuilt. So these are not one phase of a building, these are multiple phases of a building, okay? The other thing that's weird about this is that it's kind of tough to tell from overhead shot, but this is fairly deep. It's about waist high. This you can walk right in. So this structure looks like it was built into the slope. And the other side of it was just open. So we're envisioning that this might be kind of like a shed style structure with like walls on two of the sides and openings out, which is also a very unique style of building for this period. We don't see a lot of examples like this. So what do we find in it? Well, that's the other intriguing thing. We found a number of animal bone fragments, most of them concentrated down here. Most of those bones are not cattle, which was what was found all across the rest of the site. They were goat. Incidentally, Ad Gefrin or Yeavering is Old English for hill of the wild goat. I'm not necessarily wanting to link those like that, but this is intriguing. It looks like most of these were butchered and probably were used maybe for tools of some sort. They were using the bone and splintering it to make bone awls or things like that. We also found loom weights. And this was really interesting. As I mentioned, the loom weights would have been used for textile. You would have these on the thread to keep the tension as you were weaving on the loom. These are fired. This is not. This is an unfired loom weight. So they started to make it out of clay. They were drying it before you would fire it, and it broke, and somebody just threw it to the side. And 1,500 years later, we picked up this loom weight. Again, sand and gravel, not clay. So they're having to bring that clay from somewhere to make these. We also found a number of nails, bead fragments, pottery, and we found this knife, heavily corroded, but you can see it under the X-ray, its kind of shape. So this building, the first newly identified excavated structure at this site since then, appears to have been a large workshop. And we think it was deliberately placed, just like everything else at Yeavering was deliberately placed, on the downslope, out of the way. You don't want the king to have to see all this workshop stuff. So if I stand here, and we were all testing it, we were all standing here, and then we were sending somebody over to where the Great Hall was, you couldn't see that person. You couldn't see even, we were holding up a tall pole, the estimated height of the building, you couldn't really see the top of it. So it looks like it's deliberately placed on the downslope, potentially for a variety of reasons, maybe to not be visible, but maybe also to be accessible down to the valley here, maybe where you're collecting clay for firing and things like that. Really fantastic preservation. We got a lot of charcoal samples out of this for carbon-14, which we're still testing at the moment. So we don't have confirmed dates yet. I was hoping I'd have them before today, but we don't. So we still are in early days. even though this project's been going on since 2005. But we have found a new building, and we have found all those burnt timber beams, which is going to help to address some of the main questions that we had. We've taken a huge number of samples that are going to help us hopefully understand what that great enclosure is. And we have a lot of geophysic results to help us basically figure out where we're going to excavate next. So in the future, I'm going back out there this August and September, and we have plans to be at least out there for the next 5 summers, if not longer. There is enough data out here that we could probably all spend the rest of our career working out here, as long as we keep getting funding, that is. But there's going to be a lot of dating analysis that's going on. We are still processing a lot of the geophysics. This is a bit more of a close-up of the geophysics of the site. This is the great enclosure, if you can see it right there. Just to kind of put you there. And this, I just wanted to flag this up to kind of reorient yourself here for where we're going this summer. And we are specifically going to go to the great enclosure because we're going to put new trenches in where you can kind of see the faintest hint of it looks like another enclosure that may have preceded it. And we want to go here, right on the edge of the Great Hall, right through the enclosure to try and understand the relationship between the two of them. So we'll be out there for about a month in late August and through September. So in another few years, I'd love to come back and tell you a little bit more about it. And thank you very much for your attention tonight. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I guess the structure makes me think of like a walkout basements in America, except being like a walkout building. Could that have been for temperature control or something?
So the sunken feature buildings? Exactly. One of the arguments people forward is that they could be like root cellars for helping preserve food and things like that. But yeah, some of this is actually a weird esoteric debate. Was there a raised floor over it or was there not? So like, were you walking right into the sunken or was there a raised floor over top and then you'd have air circulation? And we aren't really quite sure. But yeah, no, exactly. That's a good point. Yeah.
You talked about textile manufacturing.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence of mending ponds or anything like that around it?
Not at this site, but we imagine there has to be some. Now, the landscape around this has dramatically changed due to industrial farming. The valley beyond, if I go back. Great question, by the way. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. So he was asking related to textiles, if there was rending ponds nearby, if we know of any of them. Presumably this area, that's the River Glen, by the way, in this image. There would have been this, even in historical context, floods every year, okay? But that river is not where it was then. It's heavily channelized now, and then they have basically drained that whole area. So the only way we're gonna find that is through coring, which we have undertaken to try and understand if we can find places like that in the landscape, but we haven't identified them. But yeah, you're right. They probably would be something nearby, definitely. Yeah.
Some of the drought that the UK has been experiencing, have you done additional aerial reconnaissance to identify additional potential sites? Yes,
excellent question. In 2018, there was a horrendous drought in that summer across all of Europe, and then last summer. Those are actually really good for landscape archaeologists and remote sensing, and we have identified potential other features that what's nice now that we have the geophysics plan, sometimes when you can't quite interpret the geophysics or you can't quite interpret the aerial photography or the drone photography, if you have the same feature in both, you go, ah, that's what it is. They sometimes fill in the blanks between them. So yeah, we go out there constantly. I do a lot of drone flights out there, but there's also a glider club out there. Which is good because they constantly take photos for us, which is bad because they're quiet. And if you're flying a drone, you have to have a lookout because you really don't want to. That would be bad. the insurance wouldn't cover that. But they go out and take a lot of pictures for us as well throughout the year. So yeah, great question. I'm just going to see if there's any. I can't get the mouse to work here. I was going to see if there's any in the chat. Is Cindy here? There's nothing in the chat. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I mean, I don't imagine there's probably not the right environment, but is there anything, any textile remnants that you found from this kind of age nearby or?
So not from nearby in the Millfield Basin, this area. There are textiles found. Typically, they are found when we find metal and they have corroded onto the metalwork, or they are found in anaerobic environments. So like really like in East Anglia, in Southern England, which is all like fens and bogs, they have found preserved textiles. Yeavering, the soils here, it's nice in some ways. This freely drained sandy soil is nice in some ways, but it's highly acidic. It's so acidic that it actually breaks down the pottery of the period. So textiles don't have a lot of chance. Human remains, Hope Taylor, we never got him to publish the bioarchaeology report. Most of the bone was gone. He was just seeing soil staining where the bodies were because of how acidic the soil was. So, but nearby, one of the most famous examples of textile from the period was identified in Northumbria. And that is Lindisfarne or Holy Island, which is just to the east of the site, right on the coast. St. Cuthbert, when he died, he was famous because his body was uncorrupted. It didn't rot. So they opened up his tomb in the 1700s, and his whole robes were preserved. So they have those in the Durham Cathedral Museum of these robes from the period. So we have examples of the textiles from the period. A little bit late, it was basically the same period of time as Yeavering, but slightly later. Great question. Yeah.
Who provides the majority of your funding?
Oh, good question. I should probably flag that out. Thank you. There we go. So initially, we had a seed corn grant to kind of get this started from Durham University and from the Gefrin Trust. But we have obtained, there's not a lot of these like big giant grants anymore. I'm finding in British archaeology. We have to go do a wide net for smaller ones. So we have the British Academy, we had a grant that did all the geophysics. And then we had grants from the Society of Antiquaries, from the Medieval Settlement Research Group, and the Society of Medieval Archaeology. That was all for this initial kind of prospection. Now that we have found a new building, we have higher hopes to get a like Leverhulme Trust grant or a very large British Academy grant. Or even wider net. We might go, well, we would have gone for a European Research Council, but this thing called Brexit happened. So that's actually affected a little bit of the funding opportunities for British archaeology. Yeah. Great question, thank you. Yeah.
So was there any need?
Was there any need? Absolutely. Have we found evidence of it? Not yet. At this site, we have found drinking horns at some of these other Great Fall complexes. Absolutely, there was mead. We know from historical accounts, we know from other archaeological sites that that's how kingship worked in that period. You basically had to pay your retainers in feasting and lots of drinking, and then you would kind of swear allegiance. Beowulf, in a lot of ways, even though it's very artistic, has a lot of truth going on behind how kingship worked in that period. But we're not going to be recreating Yeavering beer like we did the Midas Touch anytime soon, because unfortunately the environmental evidence, that acidic soil has eaten away. But that leads me to another thing. One of our future funders, actually, they are opening a brand new whiskey distillery in the town of Wooler called Ad Gefrin. They are kind of capitalizing on this site's history. And there is an early medieval archaeologist on the board of that distillery. So they're going to have a museum there hosting our artifacts. And hopefully for American archaeologists that like whiskey, free tastings for the archaeologists. But that will be in the future. They're actually talking about when you do a tour of the distillery, they'll have a bus to take you out to the site as well. So yeah, a little bit related slightly to what you asked. Yeah.
Online question.
Okay.
Is there anything you hope to find when you open up the great enclosure?
So the great enclosure, great question online. What we're hoping for is to understand a little bit more how it may or may not have been used. So we're opening it specifically because there is this weird relationship of the Great Hall almost ending at the wall of the great enclosure, and it's this double palisade, and on the other side, there are graves. So there had to have been some weird relationship going on between them, and that's what we're hoping to find out. The other trench we're opening in that area is because it looks like on the crop marks, there might have been an earlier enclosure, a smaller enclosure that was never been identified before. So we're hoping to see if that's true or not.
Other than the venerable Bede, do you know of any other documents of the time, Western world, that these rely on? Is it very...
Talking about Yeavering? No. I mean, sorry, I know that there is none. I should put it that way, not that I don't know. There are other documents of the period talking about some other Great Hall complexes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, which is a bit later in the date, talks about the Great Hall complex at Lyminge. But Yeavering kind of disappears from memory. And I think that's partially because Northumbria, even though it's this really powerful kingdom, because the Vikings target it, it kind of disappears from memory. And Wessex, with Alfred the Great, later on, that becomes the dominant kind of English kingdom. Basically because they were less when the Vikings attacked, they had time to consolidate their power and they could fight back. Northumbria got hit hard first and they didn't really recover. Maybe if they put their buildings inside their enclosures, they might have had a better chance. But that's maybe a bit facetious, but good question. Yeah. So great question. Yeavering and how it looks is very confined to that part of Northumberland. But there are some other Great Hall complexes found up in like the middle of like Aberdeenshire and Perthshire up in Scotland. They're not quite shaped the same, but they are these kind of kingly residences of large halls. One of the more famous ones, it's called Briney. It's been excavated by Gordon Noble out of Aberdeen, and it shares some similarities with Yeavering, and that is hundreds of miles north of Yeavering, which I know hundreds of miles for Americans doesn't sound like a lot, but for Britain, that's practically the other side of the planet. So, yeah.
But you brought up the Durham from Gordon.
Yeah.
And they had the very ornate wood carvings.
Mm-hmm.
Is there evidence to suggest they would have had similarly ornate structures?
So yes, great question. Great. I'm sorry, I cut you off. So what we can infer though is from the tools that we find, the metal tools, there's a whole suite of carpentry tools that are beyond the fact of just making a house. They're almost like much more ornate chisels that imply really sophisticated carpentry. What we have found, not in Britain, but in Scandinavia, where there's a bit better preservation of some of these, very sophisticated carved wood of similar kind of Great Hall complexes. They're a little bit different shaped, but they're the same time period and same idea. So they would have had the skills, yeah.
Are you able to track like cultural similarities between the tools used? Like, I don't know how much of it is sort of like independently invented, aha, we have this kind of chisel, or if it's a, oh, we see this chisel tracking along these tree branches or something.
That I don't know. And I think that's a really good question. I'll have to go and read up on that. I'm not sure. I'm not as much of a material culturalist as I should be as an archaeologist. Great question though.
And we need to wrap up. We have to get out of here by 8. But a couple of quick things. First of all, another round of applause for our speakers. We'll keep him on the board and have him back in a couple of years with new information about his work. Second of all, we have raffles, which we always do. We have 2 books to give away this year. The way